Hashtag Part 1, The House on Willow Street. There's something about the way the moon hangs over Willow Street. It always feels heavier there, like it's dragging the sky down with it. The houses along that road have seen better days, peeling paint, windows stained with dust, and mailboxes leaning like gravestones. But there's one house in particular, number 218, that nobody talks about. It's been empty for years, at least according to the neighbors, but I know better. I've seen the lights flicker inside. I've heard whispers seeping through its cracked walls. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. My friends and I had been drinking, stupidly daring each other to break into the place. It's just an old house, they said. What's the worst that could happen? Looking back, I wish I had turned around and walked away. But that's the thing about peer pressure, it pushes you into dark places you're never meant to go. We got to the house just past midnight, the kind of hour where the air feels thin and your breath comes out in foggy bursts. Willow Street was quiet, too quiet, like the whole world had gone to sleep without us. The house loomed ahead, its dark outline barely visible against the backdrop of dead trees. It was Derek's idea to break in. He always had a thing for exploring places that should be left alone. "Come on," he called out as he hopped the fence with ease, "are you scared?" I wasn't scared. At least, that's what I kept telling myself as I followed him. Amy and Jake were behind me, the four of us moving like shadows, avoiding the cracked streetlights that still flickered now and then. As we got closer, I noticed the windows of the house. They weren't just dark, they seemed to absorb the light from the street, swallowing it whole. That's when I first felt the unease creeping into my bones, like something was watching us, waiting. I looked up at the second floor and froze. There, in the window, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette, standing perfectly still. "Guys," I whispered, grabbing Amy's arm. "There's someone up there." Derek snorted. "Oh, come on. Don't start with that shit. It's probably a reflection or something." But it wasn't a reflection. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. It just stood there, staring down at us. Amy squeezed my hand, her fingers trembling. "Let's just go inside and get this over with," she muttered, her voice shaky. We didn't say anything more. There was no point. Once Derek had his mind set on something, there was no talking him out of it. So we followed him, pushing open the rusted gate, the creak echoing in the still night. The front door was half-rotted, hanging off its hinges, like it had been waiting for someone to push through. And that's exactly what Derek did. The smell hit us first. It wasn't just musty or old, it was something else, something decayed. Like the air itself had gone sour. We stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath our weight, and the door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the empty house. Jake tried to turn on his flashlight, but the bulb flickered and died. "Damn thing," he muttered, shaking it. Derek chuckled, but it sounded forced. "All right, let's split up," he said, trying to sound brave. "We'll cover more ground that way." I don't know why, but in that moment, I felt a jolt of fear, the kind that twists your gut into knots. "We shouldn't split up," I blurted out, louder than I meant to. Everyone turned to look at me. Amy's face was pale, and even Derek seemed less sure of himself. But Jake was the one who surprised me. "She's right," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "We stay together." We agreed, sticking close as we moved deeper into the house. The silence inside was suffocating, broken only by the sound of our footsteps. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but then I noticed the symbols were repeated, almost ritualistic. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, drawing our eyes to them, and the further we walked, the more I felt like something was watching us. Not just from the outside, but from the walls themselves. It was Amy who found the door. Hidden behind a thick layer of cobwebs at the end of a long hallway, it was small, almost unnoticeable. "Guys," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. "There's something behind this." Derek, ever the fearless leader, brushed past her and yanked the door open with a groan. The stench that followed was unbearable, like rotting meat and sulfur mixed into one. We covered our noses as we peered into the room. At first, it looked empty. Just another forgotten corner of the house. But then I saw it, a small, dusty mirror hanging on the far wall. It wasn't cracked or broken like everything else in the house. No, it was pristine, untouched, almost glowing. "That's creepy as hell," Jake muttered. "Let's go." But Derek, of course, had to get closer. He stepped into the room, reaching out to touch the mirror. "What's the matter?" he asked, turning to us with a grin. "Afraid of a little reflect?" Before he could finish, his reflection in the mirror shifted. It moved, out of sync with him, just slightly, like a delayed image on a broken TV. But then it smiled, an impossibly wide, unnatural grin, and its eyes, they were black. Deep, hollow pits where his eyes should have been. "Derek," I tried to warn him, but it was too late. His reflection reached out of the mirror and grabbed him. The real Derek screamed, a sound so raw and primal it made my blood run cold. We watched, paralyzed with fear, as his body was pulled toward the glass, disappearing inch by inch into the impossible darkness of the mirror. His eyes locked onto mine in that last moment, filled with pure, unadulterated terror. And then he was gone. The mirror shattered, the pieces falling to the ground like shards of black ice. The room went silent again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This was something darker, heavier, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for its next victim. We didn't wait around to find out who that would be. We ran, tripping over ourselves as we bolted down the hallway, out the door, and into the cold night air. But even as we escaped, I could feel it. That presence. It wasn't confined to the house anymore. It had followed us. #### Part 2, Shadows That Follow. The moment we broke free from the house, it felt like the weight of the world crashed back into place, pressing down on us. The air outside was sharp, biting at our faces as we ran down Willow Street, but it still felt safer than the thick, suffocating dark inside that cursed place. Amy stumbled first, her foot catching on a crack in the sidewalk. She fell hard, scraping her knees on the concrete. "Leave me," she screamed, panic thick in her voice, but Jake and I weren't about to leave her behind. I grabbed her arm and yanked her up. For a moment, I thought she wouldn't get back up at all, that she'd crumple into the pavement and be swallowed by whatever had taken Derek. But she did, her breath ragged and heavy as we kept running. I don't remember how long we ran, but we didn't stop until we reached the edge of town. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but the adrenaline kept me moving. When we finally stopped, collapsing against the chain-link fence by the old gas station, none of us spoke. We just stared at each other, trying to process what the hell had just happened. Derek was gone. And it wasn't just that we had left him behind in the house. No, he was gone. Pulled into that mirror, into whatever hellish thing had been waiting inside it. I could still hear his scream in my ears, echoing, twisting, as if the very sound of his voice had been yanked into that dark place with him. Amy was sobbing now, tears cutting through the dirt on her face. "We have to call the police," she gasped. "We can't leave him in there." Jake, still bent over, trying to catch his breath, shook his head. "Call them? And tell them what, Amy? That Derek got sucked into a mirror?" He looked at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "They'll think we're insane. No one's going to believe us." He was right, of course. But the thought of doing nothing, of leaving Derek's fate sealed inside that twisted house, was unbearable. "We should have never gone in there," I muttered. My voice sounded small, even to me. "We should have listened." Jake slammed his fist into the fence, the sound ringing out into the empty street. "Too late for that," he growled. "But we can't just." Before he could finish, the streetlight above us flickered. We all froze, our eyes snapping up at the bulb as it buzzed faintly, dimming for a brief second before returning to its pale yellow glow. "Did you see that?" Amy whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jake muttered, looking over his shoulder toward Willow Street, where the shadows seemed thicker than before, clinging to the buildings like oil. "We need to get out of here. Now." We started walking, more cautious this time, no longer sprinting, but moving with the urgency of prey trying to escape a predator it can't quite see. The quiet of the town pressed down on us, every footstep on the cracked pavement echoing in the silence. I kept looking behind us. I couldn't help it. Every time a tree branch rustled or a trash can rattled, my heart jumped into my throat. I kept expecting to see Derek. Not the Derek we knew, but something that looked like him, something wearing his face but with that horrible, black-eyed grin from the mirror. We finally made it back to Amy's house. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly it took her 3 tries to unlock the door. The moment we stepped inside, I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. We were safe, or at least I wanted to believe we were. The house was warm, familiar, filled with the soft glow of the living room lamp and the scent of Amy's mom's vanilla candles. It felt normal. But normal was a lie now. Amy locked the door behind us, sliding the chain across the bolt before collapsing onto the couch. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. Jake stood by the window, peeking through the blinds as if he expected something to come banging on the door at any second. "We can't stay here," I whispered. Jake glanced at me, his face pale. "Where the hell else are we supposed to go?" I didn't have an answer for that. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened in that house, what had taken Derek. But every time I thought of it, my thoughts hit a wall, like my brain refused to make sense of the impossible. All I knew was that something unnatural had come for us, and it wasn't done. We'd left the house, but whatever was inside hadn't stayed behind. I could feel it. The same heaviness that hung over Willow Street had followed us. It was in the room with us now, slinking in the corners where the light didn't reach. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:47 a.m. We had barely survived an hour since the nightmare began. And then, the scratching started. At first, it was faint, just a light scraping sound, like nails on a chalkboard, barely audible. Amy looked up from her hands, her tear-streaked face going pale. "What is that?" Jake turned his head slowly, his eyes wide. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and it was coming from outside the living room window. We all stared at the window in silence, too afraid to move. The curtains hung motionless, and for a second, I thought maybe it was just a branch or some animal. But then I saw it. A hand. Pale, thin, with fingers too long, pressed against the glass. Its nails were black, and the skin was pulled tight over the bones, like it hadn't seen the sun in years. The hand moved slowly, dragging its nails across the window in long, deliberate strokes. None of us spoke. None of us breathed. The hand slid out of view, leaving only the faint smudge of its touch on the glass. "We need to get upstairs," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now." We didn't argue. Amy scrambled off the couch, her legs shaky as she grabbed onto Jake for support. I took one last glance at the window before following them up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The scratching had stopped, but I could still feel the presence outside. It was waiting. Watching. Once we were upstairs, we barricaded ourselves in Amy's room, pushing the dresser against the door and locking the windows tight. Amy sat on the bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes wide and glassy. Jake paced back and forth, muttering under his breath, as if he was trying to convince himself we were safe. But I knew better. I could feel it. That creeping, suffocating darkness from the house, it had latched onto us. And it wasn't going to let go. I walked to the window, pulling the curtains just enough to peek outside. The street below was empty, silent. But that didn't comfort me. I knew something was there. Something lurking just beyond the edges of my sight. And then I saw it. Standing at the far end of the street, just barely visible in the moonlight, a figure. Tall, dark, with hollow, black eyes. Watching us. Watching me. ### Part 3, The Hollow-Eyed Watcher. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. The figure at the end of the street was unmistakable, tall, motionless, and those eyes, black as midnight, bore into me like they were drawing something out, something deep inside. "Did you see it?" Jake asked, his voice sharp with panic as he grabbed my arm. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. "It's watching us. It's still out there." Amy let out a soft whimper, curling tighter into herself on the bed. "What does it want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why is it doing this?" I didn't have an answer. None of us did. But I had a sinking feeling it all started with that damn house, with whatever dark force had taken Derek. And now it was coming for us. Jake paced the room, his hands running through his hair. "We need to leave town," he said, his voice breaking through the thick tension in the room. "Pack our shit and get as far away from Willow Street as possible. Whatever this is, it can't follow us forever, right?" Amy glanced up, her face streaked with tears. "You think running will help?" "We left the house, and it followed us. It's already inside." She pointed to the window, her hands shaking. Jake stopped pacing and stared at her, the weight of her words settling over all of us. It wasn't just outside. We knew that. The cold air pressing in, the flickering lights, the hand on the window, this thing wasn't bound by walls or doors. It had broken through the boundary between its world and ours. "We're not safe anywhere," I said quietly, the realization making my chest tighten. "Running won't stop it." "So, what do we do then?" Jake snapped, his voice cracking with fear. "Wait around for it to pick us off one by one." I didn't want to admit it, but the thought had already crossed my mind. We were like fish in a barrel, sitting ducks waiting for the inevitable. But there had to be a way out, something we hadn't thought of yet. I couldn't let this thing take us without a fight. "We need to figure out what it is," I said, thinking out loud. "What it wants. Maybe it's tied to the house, but we didn't stay long enough to find out." Amy looked horrified. "You want to go back? Are you insane? Derek's dead because of that place." Jake shook his head furiously. "No way. We're not going back there." "I don't want to go back," I said, my voice rising. "But what choice do we have? We can't keep running if we don't know what we're up against. If we're going to survive this, we need answers." For a moment, there was only silence. Amy wiped her tears, trying to pull herself together. Jake looked like he wanted to punch a wall, his knuckles turning white as he clenched his fists. But neither of them could come up with an alternative. Finally, Amy spoke, her voice quiet and broken. "Fine. But we don't stay long. We get in, get whatever we need, and get out." I nodded, though every fiber of my being was screaming not to go back. But I knew this was the only way. There was something inside that house, something we missed. And if we didn't figure it out, it was going to consume us, just like it had consumed Derek. Jake grabbed his phone from his pocket. "I'll drive. We can take my car." As he turned toward the door, the lights in Amy's room flickered, the bulb buzzing loudly for a second before plunging us into complete darkness. "Shit!" Amy gasped, scrambling off the bed. I pulled out my phone, its screen casting a dim light over the room. "Everyone, stay calm," I whispered, even though I could feel the panic rising in my own chest. That's when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tap-tap-tap on the window. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was unmistakable, deliberate. Jake held up his phone, shining the light toward the window. The curtains swayed slightly, as if something had brushed against them from the outside. Don't open it," Amy whimpered, backing away from the window. She pressed herself against the far wall, trembling. I didn't intend to. But the tapping persisted, louder this time, insistent. Whatever was outside wanted us to look. I could feel it, the same pull I'd felt when I saw the figure standing at the end of the street. Something was trying to draw us in, to break us. Jake stood frozen, his light trained on the window. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, though I knew we all had the same answer. It was the thing. The one that had followed us. Tap tap tap. The sound echoed in the room, louder now, closer. My heart raced as I tried to think of what to do next. We couldn't leave the room, not with that thing right outside, but staying here any longer felt like a death sentence. And then the voice came. A soft, raspy whisper, coming from the other side of the window. "Derek." It stretched out his name, like it was savoring each syllable. "Let me in." Amy screamed, collapsing onto the bed, covering her ears. Jake took a step back, his face pale. The voice sounded wrong, inhuman, like it was mimicking a human voice but couldn't quite get it right. "We have to go," I shouted, grabbing Jake's arm and yanking him toward the door. He didn't hesitate this time. We shoved the dresser out of the way, the heavy wood scraping against the floor as we barreled out of the room, Amy close behind us. The voice followed, growing louder, angrier. "You can't hide. Not from me." We stumbled down the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. The front door was just ahead, salvation just a few feet away. But then, without warning, the temperature dropped, freezing cold air biting at our skin. I could see my breath hanging in the air, and I knew, deep down, that we weren't going to make it out. Not this time. I reached for the door handle, my fingers numb, when a shadow passed over the window beside it. I jerked my hand back, instinctively retreating. There, just outside the glass, was the figure, its black, hollow eyes staring at me, unblinking. It smiled. I slammed the door shut again, locking it in a blind panic. "We can't go out there," I gasped. "We're trapped," Jake shouted, backing away. "What do we do now?" The shadows crept under the doorframe, slithering like smoke into the house. I could feel the presence growing, suffocating the air around us. It was here. It was inside. I had to think fast. "The attic," I said breathlessly. "We can hide in the attic." Amy shook her head violently. No, it'll find us there. We don't have a choice." I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the narrow staircase at the back of the house. We raced up the steps, every creak of the wood sounding like a death knell. As we reached the top, I glanced back one last time. The shadows were climbing the stairs behind us, curling around the banister like dark tendrils reaching out for us. We pulled open the attic door and slammed it behind us. The air up here was thick with dust, cobwebs clinging to the corners. The light was dim, barely enough to see by. We huddled together, trying to quiet our breathing as the sounds of the house grew louder, the creaking floorboards, the faint whispers. And then, silence. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the sound of our frantic breaths in the darkness. But I knew better. The quiet was worse. It meant the thing was waiting, lurking, watching us. And in the silence, I could feel its eyes on us again, those empty, hollow voids that had swallowed Derek whole. The real horror hadn't even begun. Part 4, Whispers from the Dark. The silence in the attic was thick, pressing against our ears, muting even the sound of our frantic breathing. Every creak of the old wood beneath our feet made us flinch, as if the house itself was shifting, preparing to swallow us whole. We huddled together, cold and terrified, the shadows from below lingering just out of sight, waiting. I strained to listen for any sign of movement outside the door, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive, suffocating quiet. And yet, I could feel it, something was still out there, lurking just beyond the thin walls, its presence undeniable. Amy was trembling beside me, her hands gripping her knees so tightly her knuckles were white. Jake paced back and forth, his eyes darting to the attic door every few seconds. The wooden slats of the attic floor creaked under his weight, but other than that, the house was unnervingly still. "We should have left when we had the chance," Jake muttered under his breath. "Now we're trapped in this fucking house with no way out." "We didn't have a choice," I shot back, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. "It was already inside. If we tried to leave, it would have gotten us." "What makes you so sure it won't get us here?" Jake snapped, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He was cracking, and I couldn't blame him. We all were. Amy whimpered, curling further into herself on the dusty floor. "It's going to kill us, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," I said firmly, though I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. "We just need to figure out what it wants. There has to be a way to stop this." "But how? What could possibly stop something that wasn't bound by the laws of our world, something that had already torn Derek out of existence like he was nothing more than a shadow?" I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something back at the house on Willow Street, some crucial piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. And the longer we stayed in the attic, the more convinced I became that we would have to go back. But even the thought of returning to that place made my skin crawl. I glanced around the attic, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was small and cramped, filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, boxes piled haphazardly in the corners. The only light came from a single grimy window that barely let in enough moonlight to illuminate the room. And then I saw it. Near the far corner of the attic, half hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a mirror. Not just any mirror, it was the mirror. The same one from the house on Willow Street, the one that had taken Derek. My heart stopped, cold terror flooding through me. "Oh my God," I breathed. It followed us. Jake stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" "The mirror," I pointed to the far corner, my hand shaking. "It's here." It followed us. Amy looked up, her face pale as she slowly turned her head toward the corner. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, the same ornate frame, the same eerie shine in the moonlight. It stood there, completely out of place, like it had been waiting for us to notice. Jake's face twisted in disbelief. "How the hell is that possible? We left it in the house. How is it here?" I didn't have an answer. None of this made sense. But deep down, I knew the mirror was at the heart of all of this. Whatever dark force had pulled Derek into that other world was tied to it. And now, it had come for us. "We need to destroy it," Amy whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's the only way." Jake shook his head. "How do we know destroying it will even work? What if it makes things worse? We can't just sit here and do nothing." I shouted, my frustration boiling over. "It took Derek, and now it's after us. We have to try something." I stood up, my legs trembling as I made my way toward the mirror. Every step felt like I was walking into the jaws of a monster, but I couldn't stop. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out, my hand hovering just inches from the cold, reflective surface. And then I saw it. In the glass, my reflection didn't match my movements. It stood still, staring back at me with eyes that were too wide, too dark. And then, slowly, it smiled, a horrible, twisted grin that stretched far beyond the edges of its face. I gasped, stumbling back, my hands flying to my mouth. Amy screamed. In the mirror, my reflection began to move on its own, stepping forward, pressing its hand against the inside of the glass. Its mouth opened, too wide, the corners tearing at the seams, revealing rows of sharp, black teeth. It mouthed something, silent, but I knew what it was saying. "Come closer." The attic door rattled violently, slamming against its frame as something pounded from the other side. Whatever was out there was getting closer, desperate to get in. "We have to go. Now!" Jake shouted, grabbing Amy's arm and pulling her toward the window. "We can climb down the trellis. It's our only way out." But I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the mirror, on the thing wearing my face, its black, soulless eyes watching me with terrifying intent. I could feel its pull, that same hypnotic tug I'd felt in the house, like it was drawing me in, urging me to cross the boundary between our worlds. I tore my gaze away, stumbling back into Jake's arms as he yanked me toward the window. He flung it open, cold night air rushing in as we scrambled out onto the narrow ledge, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The trellis barely held our weight as we climbed down, each rung creaking under the strain. The pounding from inside the attic grew louder, more desperate, as we descended, but I refused to look back. I couldn't. I knew if I did, I would see it, the thing in the mirror, watching us, waiting for its chance. Finally, we hit the ground, our feet sinking into the cold dirt as we sprinted away from the house, not stopping until we reached the street. Only then did we dare to look back. The house was dark, its windows empty and lifeless, but the attic light flickered once, twice, and then went out. "What the hell just happened?" Jake gasped, his chest heaving as he doubled over, clutching his knees. "That mirror, it was alive." Amy was sobbing, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she collapsed onto the curb. "We're not safe," she whispered through her tears. "We'll never be safe." I stood in the middle of the street, staring up at the house, trying to piece together what we had just witnessed. The mirror, the thing inside it, it wasn't just a portal. It was alive, feeding off of us, drawing us in. And now, it had followed us. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice hollow, defeated. I didn't know. The mirror was out of the house, but we hadn't escaped it. It was a part of us now, attached to us like a shadow. We couldn't run, couldn't hide. No matter where we went, it would find us. And it would finish what it started. Hashtag Part 5, the final descent. We stood on that empty street, frozen in the aftermath of our escape, but deep down, I knew it was far from over. The darkness from that mirror had followed us, attaching itself like a parasite. It had crossed over, breaking the barrier between our world and whatever hell it came from. The air felt thick and oppressive, as if the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to take the next wrong step. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting back to the house. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to keep moving." Amy was huddled on the curb, still crying softly, her body trembling with fear. "There's nowhere to go," she muttered, her voice hollow. "It'll find us no matter where we run. There's no escaping this." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that we'd figure it out, that we'd survive, but the words stuck in my throat. Because I knew she was right. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't bound to the house anymore. It wasn't trapped by walls or windows. It had tasted us, and now it was hunting us. I glanced back at the house one last time. The attic window was dark, but I could feel it, the thing watching us, waiting for the moment we let our guard down. My reflection from the mirror still haunted me, that twisted grin burned into my memory. It had looked so much like me, but it wasn't me. And it had wanted me to join it, to pull me into that dark place beyond the glass. "We have to go back," I said quietly, my voice shaky but resolute. Jake snapped his head toward me, disbelief etched across his face. "What? You're out of your mind if you think we're stepping foot in that house again." "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not the house. The source of this, whatever it is, it started with the mirror. That's where we have to go." Amy looked up at me, her tear-streaked face full of desperation. "The mirror?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You want to go back into that thing? After what it did to Derek?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "We don't have a choice. We can't outrun this. It'll find us no matter where we go. The only way to stop it is to face it." Jake cursed under his breath, pacing back and forth. "Face it? How the hell do we face something that's not even human? It's a nightmare, man, and you want us to just walk into it?" I didn't want to. Every part of me screamed to run, to hide, to forget this whole thing ever happened. But the truth was, there was no hiding. We were marked, and the only way out was through. "Look," I said, my voice steadier now. "I think the mirror is more than just some cursed object. It's a gateway, a way for whatever's on the other side to reach into our world. But it's not fully here yet. That's why it's hunting us, because we're the last barrier. We're its way in." Jake stopped pacing, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "You're saying, what? That it's using us to cross over?" "Yes," I said, feeling a chill crawl down my spine. "And if we don't stop it, it'll take us all. One by one." Amy's sobs had quieted, her face pale but focused. "How do we stop it?" she asked, her voice a whisper. I didn't have an exact answer, but I knew the mirror held the key. "We go back to the mirror," I said. "We face it, and we break whatever connection it has to us." Jake let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane. But, what other choice do we have?" We didn't have any other choice. Without another word, we started walking back toward the house. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pulling us back, dragging us toward the inevitable. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The world around us felt wrong, warped, like a bad dream that we couldn't wake from. When we reached the house, it loomed ahead like a dark sentinel, waiting for our return. The windows were empty, black voids that swallowed the light. The front door hung open slightly, just as we had left it. But now, there was something different about it, an air of expectation, like the house was inviting us back in. Jake swallowed hard, his face pale. "We go in, grab the mirror, and we smash it. Simple, right?" Nothing about this was simple. But we nodded anyway. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us with every breath. The house groaned, the old floorboards creaking under our weight as we made our way toward the attic stairs. I could feel the presence more strongly now, like a shadow just out of sight, watching, waiting. When we reached the attic, the door was still closed, but there was a low, soft whisper coming from the other side. It wasn't any language I recognized, just a rhythmic, haunting murmur that sent chills down my spine. Amy hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. "Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted. "But it's the only way." With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The attic was exactly as we had left it, but the mirror, it was different. It no longer sat in the corner like some forgotten relic. Now, it stood in the center of the room, perfectly upright, as if it had been placed there on purpose. The surface shimmered in the dim light, rippling like water, and behind the glass, I could see movement. Shapes, indistinct and dark, shifting just beneath the surface. "This is it," Jake whispered. "We break it, and we're free." But before any of us could move, the mirror moved. It tilted forward, just slightly, as if it was being pushed from the other side. And then, from within the glass, the shadows solidified. My reflection stepped forward, grinning that same twisted grin, its black eyes locking onto mine. "You can't leave," it whispered, its voice like rusted nails scraping against my skull. "You're already part of this. You belong to me now." The attic door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the room like a death knell. Amy screamed, backing away from the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. Jake grabbed a nearby chair, raising it above his head. "Screw this," he shouted, bringing it down with all his strength against the glass. But the mirror didn't break. Instead, it absorbed the blow, rippling like water. The shadows behind the glass surged forward, and my reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the inside of the mirror. "Come closer," it whispered, its grin widening. "Let me show you what it's like on the other side." Jake swung the chair again, and again, but the mirror remained intact, the surface rippling with each strike. "We can't break it," he yelled, panic rising in his voice. "What the hell do we do?" I stared into the mirror, at the thing wearing my face, its black eyes locked onto mine. And then I realized, it wasn't the mirror we needed to destroy. It was the connection. The reflection wasn't just a twisted version of me. It was me, or at least, it was trying to be. "I have to break the link," I whispered, more to myself than to the others. "What?" Amy cried, her voice frantic. I didn't answer. Instead, I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the reflection. The closer I got, the more I felt it pulling me in, like gravity, drawing me toward the glass. "Stop!" Jake yelled, grabbing my arm. "What the hell are you doing?" "I have to do this," I said, pulling free. "I have to face it." I stepped closer, my breath fogging up the glass. My reflection smiled, its black eyes gleaming with hunger. And then, slowly, I reached out, pressing my hand against the cold surface of the mirror. For a moment, nothing happened. And then, with a sudden lurch, I felt it, the connection. It was like being pulled into a freezing current, the dark waters of the mirror wrapping around me, dragging me under. I could see flashes of images, memories, twisted and warped, Derek's terrified face, the hand on the window, the shadows crawling up the walls. It was all connected, all part of the same dark force that had been hunting us. But I wasn't going to let it win. With all my strength, I pushed back, fighting against the pull, forcing the connection to break. The mirror rippled violently, and my reflection's grin faltered, its eyes widening in shock. "No," it whispered, its voice filled with rage. "You can't leave." But I wasn't listening. I pulled my hand away from the glass, the force of the severed connection sending a shockwave through the room. The mirror shattered, the glass exploding outward in a shower of jagged shards. For a moment, everything was silent. And then, slowly, the air began to lift. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us was gone. The shadows retreated, the room growing lighter, warmer. The presence, that thing was gone. We had won. Jake collapsed onto the floor, breathing heavily, his face pale with exhaustion. Amy stood in stunned silence, her eyes wide as she stared at the shattered remains of the mirror. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded, too exhausted to speak. We had survived. But I knew, deep down, that we hadn't truly escaped. We had severed the connection, broken the mirror's hold on us. But the darkness was still out there, waiting. The end.